A black veteran gets stopped by a cop who doesn't know his story. But just 2 minutes later, his old commander arrives, and everything changes in a way you won't expect. Stick around to see how this surprising encounter unfolds. You won't want to miss the ending. Before we jump into the story, comment below where you're watching from. And if you like this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss more like it. A quiet morning light spread over the small town streets as David Williams walked slowly, his boots making soft sounds on the pavement. Dressed in an old, well-worn jacket with faint traces of military patches, David carried himself with a quiet pride, his steps steady despite a slight limp that hinted at past injuries. His face was calm, lined with experience, and his dark eyes held a quiet strength. He stopped at a small local coffee cart by the sidewalk, nodding politely to the young barista who recognized him from his regular visits. As he reached for his wallet, he smiled, a familiar warmth easing into his expression. "Morning, Mr. Williams," the barista greeted, handing him a steaming cup. David accepted it with a nod, thanking her softly. He took a sip, feeling the warmth spread through him as he turned to look out over the empty street, a faint trace of nostalgia in his eyes. His gaze drifted far, as though he were remembering something distant, maybe mornings like this spent with his old squad, perhaps an old memory of his days in service. His fingers brushed a small medal pinned inside his jacket, a quiet reminder of his past, close to his heart but hidden from view. Just then his phone buzzed in his pocket. He fished it out, answering with a calm, "Hello." On the other end was his wife, her familiar voice carrying through the line, asking about his day, if he'd had breakfast yet. David chuckled, a sound both warm and amused, assuring her he was fine, just out for his usual morning walk and enjoying the quiet. He glanced around the peaceful street, feeling at ease. The sun was rising higher now, casting long shadows on the pavement, as David continued his quiet conversation, keeping his voice low. Across the street, Officer Mark Simmons drove slowly, eyes scanning his surroundings out of habit. He was a young officer, new to the force and eager to make a good impression. When he noticed David standing alone by the coffee cart, his eyes lingered. Mark couldn't explain why, but something about David seemed out of place to him. Maybe it was the jacket, worn and patched, or perhaps it was the way David stood with his phone in hand, so relaxed and unbothered. Mark's suspicion flickered, a subtle wariness growing in his gaze as he parked his patrol car nearby and stepped out, adjusting his belt and squaring his shoulders. He didn't know who David was, didn't see the man's medals, didn't catch the quiet confidence in his expression. To Mark, David was just another stranger on his beat, someone to question, someone to inspect. David ended his call, slipping the phone back into his jacket pocket. He turned to head down the street, his gait steady, though each step held a faint trace of stiffness from old injuries. Just as he took a few steps, he noticed the young officer approaching. David met his gaze, offering a polite nod, assuming the officer might be looking for directions or perhaps just offering a morning greeting. But Officer Simmons's expression remained rigid, focused, and a touch too intense. David's polite nod was met with a hard stare. "Good morning, sir," Mark began, his tone firm and official. "Can I ask what you're doing here?" His eyes flickered over David's jacket, his stance shifting with a faint edge of authority, as though preparing to assert himself if needed. David, taken aback for a moment, managed a calm smile. "Just out for a walk. Got my coffee talking to my wife on the phone." He gestured to his cup and nodded toward the street he'd been about to walk down. "It's a peaceful morning." Mark's eyes narrowed slightly, his gaze scrutinizing every detail, as if searching for something suspicious. "Mind if I see some identification?" he asked, his tone still carrying that unyielding edge. He crossed his arms, his stance widening slightly, reinforcing his position. David's smile faded slightly. He reached slowly into his jacket, keeping his movements deliberate, and pulled out his wallet, handing over his ID without complaint. But his expression tightened, and a hint of disappointment flickered in his eyes. He'd dealt with this kind of scrutiny before, but he had hoped that perhaps it would be different now, years after his service, years after proving himself. He stood quietly as Mark looked over his ID, glancing from the card to David, clearly skeptical. David Williams, Mark read slowly as though trying to place the name, looking at him as if it should mean something. But there was no recognition in Mark's face, only doubt and a growing impatience. Mark handed the ID back but didn't step back. Instead, he asked, "So, are you from around here, Mr. Williams?" David took a slow breath, steadying himself. "Born and raised, actually. I served for most of my life, but I came back home a few years ago." He held Mark's gaze, calm but firm, not flinching under the officer's stare. Mark's expression remained skeptical, his eyes lingering on David's jacket, his hands unconsciously tightening at his sides. To him, David's calmness seemed almost too assured, his answers too steady. Mark shifted his weight, his suspicion thickening as he glanced at David's jacket once more, his eyes catching the faint outlines of the patches and medals that had once adorned it. Despite David's steady presence and polite demeanor, something about him seemed to irritate Mark, as if he couldn't reconcile the casual air with the man standing before him. "Mind telling me where you're headed?" Mark asked, his tone edged with suspicion that now felt too sharp for such a simple question. David held his gaze, a hint of disappointment in his eyes, though his voice remained calm. "Just down the block. I like to walk the same route every morning. Clears my head, you know." But Mark wasn't satisfied. He looked around, as if searching for some justification, something that would make this encounter more than just an awkward misunderstanding. "We've had some reports lately. People hanging around places they shouldn't be, causing trouble," Mark said, his tone stiff. It was clear he was fishing for a reason, any reason, to keep David there, as if the lack of any real issue bothered him more than the presence of one. David's expression hardened just for a moment. "Well, I don't think I fit that description, officer. I'm just here to enjoy the morning." Mark felt the subtle shift in David's tone, and it only made him more determined to assert control. The feeling gnawed at him, the discomfort of not being fully in command, of having his authority questioned, even if only by David's calm and measured responses. Without another word, Mark reached down to his radio, his fingers hovering, considering his next move. "You don't mind if I ask you a few more questions, do you?" Mark asked, his voice colder now. David's face remained composed, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "I've given you everything you need to know. My name, my reason for being here." His voice was respectful, but there was a note of finality, a line he clearly intended to draw. But Mark didn't back down. He took a step closer, his hand resting on his belt, his posture imposing. "Look, sir, you might be hiding something. Just because you're walking around here like you own the place doesn't mean—" David's calm demeanor shifted, a flicker of hurt passing over his face before he controlled it, standing a little straighter. For the first time, his voice carried a quiet warning. "Officer, I've already told you why I'm here. I don't think there's anything more to explain." But Mark, feeling that his authority was slipping in the face of David's quiet strength, tightened his grip on his radio. With a quick movement, he spoke into it, calling in backup for what he labeled as a suspicious individual. As David stood there, he felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him, the quiet street suddenly feeling far too small. He watched Mark call for backup, disappointment settling deeper into his expression, though he kept his posture straight, refusing to let frustration or anger show. He'd been through this kind of treatment before, moments where his calm and dignity were met with doubt and suspicion. He thought maybe, just maybe, things would have changed by now. Mark's voice echoed over the radio, crisp and commanding, as he described David in sparse, cold terms. Male, mid-50s, acting evasive, possible loiterer, requesting additional support. The words felt sterile, stripped of any sense of the person standing in front of him. David, listening, felt a chill, not at the description but at the knowledge that Mark was shaping him into something he wasn't, creating a narrative that didn't match the reality. As Mark finished his call, He looked back at David with a renewed sense of authority, as if having backup on the way justified his actions. The silence between them grew thicker, tension hanging in the air. David took a slow breath, his mind racing. He knew he had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, being held in place, questioned, and doubted. But he held himself steady, keeping his gaze level. A few moments later, the distant sound of sirens cut through the quiet morning air. David's expression remained composed, but his heart sank slightly. The sound was unmistakable, bringing memories he'd rather not revisit. He had faced real dangers before, had risked his life countless times in places far more dangerous than this quiet town, all to protect and serve people like Mark, people who now couldn't see past their own assumptions. Mark's gaze never left him, a sense of triumph flickering in his eyes, as if backup arriving proved he was right to doubt this man, to hold him here. David, feeling the weight of that look, finally spoke, his voice calm but carrying a hint of resolve. "Officer, I served this country for over 20 years. I think I deserve a little more respect than this." Mark's expression hardened, unwilling to let go of his control. "Service or not, respect is earned, and right now, all I see is someone acting suspicious. So why don't you cooperate and wait right here?" David shook his head slightly, disappointment evident. He had hoped his words might break through, might show Mark that he wasn't someone to be feared, wasn't someone hiding anything. But as the sirens grew louder, he knew that whatever he said wouldn't matter. This officer had already made up his mind, had already decided who David was in his eyes, and now, with backup on the way, there was nothing more he could do but wait. The sirens grew closer, piercing through the early morning calm, until finally, another police car pulled up to the curb. The door opened, and out stepped another officer, one with a more experienced, seasoned look. But it wasn't just any officer. This was Colonel Samuel Green, a man with a commanding presence, dressed sharply in his uniform. David recognized him immediately, and a hint of surprise softened his expression. Colonel Green had been his commanding officer years ago, a man he'd served under in times of crisis, someone who had seen him at his best and worst. Colonel Green quickly surveyed the situation, his sharp eyes taking in the scene. David standing tall but tense, hands at his sides, and Officer Mark Simmons standing rigid, his expression a mix of unease and stubborn authority. Mark seemed momentarily unsure, his gaze flickering with recognition as he saw Green's rank and posture, though he was unaware of the full extent of his presence here. "Good morning, officer," Colonel Green greeted Mark, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable authority. "I received a call about a suspicious individual here. Mind telling me what's going on?" Mark, taken aback but determined to hold his ground, cleared his throat and replied, "Yes, sir. This man was acting evasive, didn't provide satisfactory answers, and I found it necessary to hold him here for further questioning." He cast a sideways glance at David, as if reinforcing his point. Colonel Green's gaze shifted to David, and a subtle warmth entered his eyes as he addressed him. "Sergeant Williams, it's been a long time." His voice carried a note of respect that contrasted sharply with Mark's suspicious tone. David relaxed slightly, giving the colonel a respectful nod, though he said nothing, letting his former commanding officer take the lead. Mark blinked, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Sergeant Williams?" he echoed, the title finally hitting him with its full weight. He glanced from Green to David, the pieces slowly beginning to fall into place, but he still clung to his authority, unwilling to release his grip on the situation just yet. "Yes," Colonel Green replied, his tone steady, a hint of impatience showing now. "Sergeant David Williams served in my unit. He's a decorated veteran, a man of honor." He let the words sink in, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked at Mark, silently questioning his judgment. Mark's face paled slightly, a flicker of discomfort passing over him. The certainty he had clung to began to unravel, replaced with the realization that he might have misjudged the man standing before him. He opened his mouth as if to speak but found himself at a loss, words failing him for the first time in the encounter. Colonel Green's gaze remained fixed on Mark, sharp and unwavering, letting the weight of his words settle fully. Mark's rigid posture started to falter, the confidence in his stance shifting to visible discomfort. He struggled to maintain eye contact with the colonel, a hint of shame creeping into his expression as he finally recognized the magnitude of his mistake. "Sergeant Williams is not someone you should ever be detaining on the side of the road without cause," Green continued, his voice firm yet composed. "This man has given more to this country than you could possibly know." He paused, letting the silence punctuate his words, the quiet almost louder than any reprimand could be. David remained silent, his gaze steady as he watched Mark wrestle with his realization. There was no smugness in David's eyes, no hint of satisfaction at seeing Mark uncomfortable, just a quiet dignity that seemed to rise above the situation. He knew, perhaps better than anyone, that moments like these were rarely about winning or losing. They were about learning, about understanding the silent power that respect and dignity held. Mark shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping momentarily before he managed to look back up at Colonel Green. I didn't know," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was just following protocol. I thought—" His voice trailed off, the justification sounding hollow even to his own ears. Colonel Green took a step closer to Mark, his voice softening but still firm. "Sometimes, officer, protocol isn't a shield for poor judgment. It doesn't excuse a lack of respect or a rush to conclusions." His words cut through the air, direct yet calm, as if he were offering a lesson rather than a reprimand. Mark swallowed, his face flushed now, the weight of his actions bearing down on him. He looked over at David, a glimmer of something close to regret in his eyes. But David remained impassive, giving him neither comfort nor condemnation. In that moment, Mark felt an uncomfortable vulnerability, as if he had been stripped of his badge and authority, left only with the reality of his own choices. Finally, Colonel Green turned to David, his expression softening. "Sergeant, I apologize on behalf of my officer. This should never have happened." His voice carried a sincerity that resonated deeply, a stark contrast to the suspicion and mistrust that had colored the interaction so far. David gave a slight nod, his voice calm as he replied, "Thank you, Colonel. I appreciate it." He looked at Mark, his gaze steady, almost compassionate. "We all make mistakes. Some of us just have to learn from them the hard way." His words hung in the air, gentle yet firm, leaving an impression far more lasting than any anger or resentment could. Mark looked down, nodding slightly, the lesson settling within him in a way he wouldn't soon forget. Colonel Green observed Mark's reaction, sensing that the lesson was beginning to sink in, but he knew there was still more to be said. Turning back to Mark, he decided to drive the message home, not as punishment but as a reminder of the responsibility that came with the uniform. "Officer Simmons," Green began, his voice even, "when you wear that badge, you represent more than just authority. You represent trust, respect, and fairness. Those principles apply to everyone, regardless of how they look or what you assume about them." He paused, giving Mark a moment to absorb his words, letting the weight of his gaze press upon the younger man. Mark's face flushed, the weight of Green's words pressing down on him, exposing the uncomfortable truth. He shifted on his feet, finally breaking eye contact as he looked down, feeling the sting of his own assumptions and the damage they had nearly caused. Every word reminded him of his own shortcomings, his rush to control and judge without understanding. David watched in silence, his calm presence almost magnifying the discomfort Mark was feeling. He could see the young officer wrestling with his shame and embarrassment, struggling between pride and regret. David knew this feeling well, the humbling realization of one's errors. He'd been there himself once, years ago, back in his early days of service. After a long, tense silence, Mark finally found his voice, though it was softer now, his earlier bravado replaced with something closer to humility. I'm sorry, Mr. Williams," he managed, his words halting but sincere. I didn't I didn't mean to disrespect you. I just thought—" He trailed off, unable to justify his actions any further. David looked at him, a faint, forgiving smile crossing his face. "I understand," he replied simply. "Sometimes it's easy to see only what we're looking for, not what's actually there." His tone was gentle, almost kind, offering Mark an unexpected grace. In that moment, David's calm presence felt like a quiet strength, one that didn't demand respect but simply commanded it by existing. Colonel Green nodded approvingly, feeling the tension in the air begin to dissolve. He turned to David once more, offering a slight bow of his head in respect. "Sergeant Williams, if there's anything I can do to make up for this situation, you have only to ask." His words were formal yet genuine, his respect for David apparent in every gesture. David shook his head lightly. "Thank you, Colonel, but that won't be necessary. I think the lesson here was enough." He gave a pointed look toward Mark, his expression softening as he added, "We all have things to learn." Mark nodded, his face solemn, understanding that David's words were an offer of forgiveness, even if he didn't deserve it. The lesson was clear, and he knew it would stay with him for a long time. He had been given a chance not only to correct his actions, but also to grow from them. A second chance not everyone was offered so freely. As the weight of the moment settled over them, a quiet pause lingered, thick with unspoken reflection. Colonel Green glanced from David to Mark, ensuring that the gravity of the encounter had fully registered. Then, with a subtle nod, he stepped back, signaling that the confrontation had come to an end. Mark felt a rush of relief, mixed with lingering shame, as he looked once more at David. His voice was softer now, humble in a way it hadn't been earlier. "Thank you, Mr. Williams. And Colonel Green." He hesitated, struggling to find the right words. I'll make sure nothing like this happens again. I see now that I was wrong." David gave him a nod of acknowledgement, his eyes steady, his voice calm. "It's not about being perfect, officer. It's about being willing to look closer, to see people as they are, not just as we expect them to be." His words carried a quiet power, each one hitting Mark with a sense of finality, yet also an invitation to improve. The street had returned to its peaceful quiet, and it seemed that the whole town held its breath in those last moments, bearing witness to the subtle, profound shift that had taken place. The tension, once thick and oppressive, had softened, leaving only the lesson that had been hard won. Colonel Green looked at David with a hint of pride, admiring the way he had handled the situation with patience and integrity. It was clear that David's strength went beyond his military service. It was woven into his character, a quiet resilience that didn't waver even under scrutiny. With a final nod of respect to David, Green addressed Mark one last time, his tone firm but encouraging. "Remember, Officer Simmons, every interaction is a choice. Choose wisely. Choose with respect." Mark absorbed the words, the weight of them settling in as he nodded, the lesson etched deeply into his mind. He glanced once more at David, his expression a mix of regret and newfound humility. Without another word, he turned and headed back to his patrol car, feeling the profound shift in himself that had taken root in this brief but transformative encounter. As Mark drove away, Colonel Green remained for a moment longer, his gaze turning back to David. A small smile crossed his face. "Take care, Sergeant. You're an example more than you know." David returned the smile with a quiet humility. "Thank you, Colonel. I just try to live the values we were taught." He raised his coffee cup in a small gesture of farewell, his eyes holding a warmth that transcended words. With that, he turned and continued on his walk, the morning sun casting a gentle glow as he resumed his path, untouched, his dignity intact. And as Colonel Green watched him go, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of respect, a respect that had been there all along, but now, after this encounter, felt all the more profound. Colonel Green lingered a moment, watching David walk away, the quiet resilience in his steps a stark contrast to the tense confrontation that had just unfolded. The early morning air felt different now. A subtle weight lifted. Green found himself reflecting on his years of service, on the countless men and women like David who had given so much of themselves, yet often went unrecognized in their everyday lives. People who carried their history quietly, without asking for anything in return. As he turned back to his own vehicle, Green noticed a few early risers looking out from nearby windows, their faces curious but respectful. They had likely witnessed parts of the interaction, and were now piecing together their own version of the story. He hoped they too understood the lesson in what had just occurred. Inside his car, Green took a moment to gather his thoughts, his mind replaying David's calm composure, his quiet dignity even in the face of unwarranted suspicion. He felt a renewed sense of responsibility, a reminder of the unseen struggles that many veterans carried back into civilian life. The world outside the military could be unkind, sometimes ignorant of the sacrifices made by those who had served. Green was determined to be a voice for those who walked through life as David did, deserving of respect but too often overlooked. Before pulling away, Green picked up his radio, intending to speak to the station. "Dispatch, this is Colonel Green. Please note that Officer Simmons may need a review session on procedural respect and handling civilian interactions." His tone was even, but there was an underlying authority that left no room for ambiguity. He wanted to ensure that the lesson extended beyond this one encounter. Simmons needed to reflect on more than just today's events. He needed to understand the broader implications of his actions, to see that respect wasn't selective nor was it optional. After a pause, dispatch confirmed his request, their tone carrying a slight surprise. Green knew that this call would set some wheels in motion, but he felt it was necessary, a small but meaningful step toward ensuring that others would not face what David had today. With a final glance down the road where David had disappeared, Green exhaled deeply, shifted his car into drive, and headed back, his thoughts filled with a renewed commitment to honor the integrity of those he had once commanded. As Colonel Green drove away, the town returned to its quiet rhythm, but the encounter left a subtle mark on the morning, like a ripple spreading through still water. Meanwhile, David continued his walk, the soft sound of his boots against the pavement as steady as his heartbeat. He moved through familiar streets, each step an assertion of resilience, a quiet defiance against the unfairness he had just endured. Though the situation had left him frustrated, he took comfort in knowing that Colonel Green had stood up for him, that his dignity had been recognized and upheld. David's thoughts drifted back to his days in the service, the camaraderie he'd shared with men like Colonel Green and others who had come to rely on one another as family. He remembered their unspoken trust, the certainty that each had the other's back, no questions asked. Civilian life, he knew, didn't often offer that kind of unbreakable bond, that automatic respect. But every so often he encountered moments that reminded him of it, like today. Colonel Green's intervention had felt like a bridge between those two worlds, a quiet but powerful reminder that respect and loyalty still held weight, even outside the uniform. As he passed familiar storefronts and greeted a few neighbors with a nod, he felt the weight of his experience shift. He realized that he had given Mark Simmons an unexpected lesson, perhaps one the young officer would remember every time he donned his badge. And though David hadn't set out to teach anything that morning, he took comfort in knowing that his quiet resistance, his steady dignity, might help shift perspectives, if only a little. David's thoughts were interrupted by the soft chime of his phone. He glanced down and saw a message from his wife, asking if he was still out walking and if he'd picked up the eggs she had asked for the previous day. With a small smile, he texted her back, reassuring her he was on his way to the store now. The simplicity of her message grounded him, reminding him of what really mattered. The small moments, the people who truly knew him, who understood his character without needing to ask. As he continued on his path, David felt a renewed sense of peace. He was a man who had faced countless challenges, some far greater than the one he'd encountered today. He knew who he was, and he knew that in the quiet strength he carried, he was honoring not only himself, but every brother and sister he'd served alongside. Today's encounter had only reinforced that truth. David made his way to the small grocery store on the corner, his mind easing back into the familiar rhythm of daily life. The hum of morning activity surrounded him as he entered, the warmth and smell of fresh produce filling the air. A few locals greeted him by name, offering friendly nods or casual waves, reminding him that here, he wasn't Sergeant or a figure of suspicion. He was just David, a neighbor, a friend. He moved through the aisles, picking up the items his wife had listed, feeling the lingering tension from the morning gradually fade with each familiar face he encountered. There was comfort in these simple exchanges, a reminder that, despite the occasional moments of misunderstanding, most people saw him for who he truly was. It gave him a sense of grounding, a reassurance that his life was bigger than the assumptions of a single officer. As he reached the checkout counter, the cashier, a middle-aged woman named Linda, who had known David for years, offered him a warm smile. "How's the morning treating you, David?" she asked, ringing up his items. David paused, considering her question, and then gave a small, thoughtful nod. "It had its challenges, Linda, but it's looking better now," he replied, his tone calm, steady. Linda gave him a knowing look, sensing there was more to his words than he was letting on. "Well, you've always handled things with more grace than most. Not many people can say that." David chuckled softly, appreciating her words. "You just have to keep going, I suppose. Can't let one rough patch ruin the whole day." He handed over his payment, feeling a weight lift a little more with the simplicity of their exchange. As he gathered his bags and turned to leave, Linda called after him, "Take care, David. And remember, people around here know who you really are." Her words resonated deeply, a quiet validation that felt like a balm over the morning's tension. David stepped back onto the street, his heart a little lighter, his mind clearer. The morning sun was higher now, casting warm light over the town, and he felt a renewed sense of peace. He walked with a quiet pride, knowing that he didn't need anyone's approval to feel whole. He had his own measure of respect, built on years of service, honor, and the simple acts of kindness he encountered every day. And as he headed home, he felt grateful for that strength, a resilience that no one could take from him. David continued his walk home, the quiet streets now filled with a renewed sense of calm. As he moved along the familiar path, he reflected on the contrast between this peaceful neighborhood and the tense moments he'd just experienced. He thought of Officer Simmons, replaying the young man's expression when the realization had finally hit him. It wasn't anger he felt toward the officer, not even resentment, just a sense of sadness that these encounters still happened, that judgment could still be so easily cast on appearance alone. As he turned the last corner toward his street, he noticed a young boy playing on the sidewalk, kicking a worn soccer ball back and forth. The boy, seeing David approach, paused and waved, a bright smile on his face. David smiled back, giving him a small wave. "Morning, Mr. Williams," the boy called out, his voice cheerful, oblivious to the complexities of the adult world. To him, David was just a familiar face, someone who walked this path every morning. "Morning, kiddo," David replied, his voice carrying warmth and a bit of relief. There was something refreshing in the simplicity of the boy's greeting, a reminder of innocence, unclouded by assumptions or suspicion. The boy kicked his ball toward David, who instinctively stopped it with his foot and rolled it back, an easy, playful interaction that reminded him of simpler times. For a moment, the memory of the morning's tension faded entirely, replaced by the child's laughter and the small exchange of goodwill. As David continued on, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Despite the challenges and the occasional confrontations, he still had moments like these, simple, genuine interactions that reminded him of what truly mattered. Respect, he realized, was something he carried within him. It wasn't something to be granted or withheld by the judgment of others. It was rooted in his actions, his values, and the life he led. Finally, he reached his front steps, the familiar comfort of home wrapping around him like a warm embrace. He took a deep breath, the morning's cool air filling his lungs, grounding him. Inside, he knew his wife would be waiting, her presence a steadfast anchor through every storm he faced. With one last look at the quiet street, he opened the door and stepped inside, leaving behind the events of the morning, yet carrying forward the quiet lessons they had left with him. As David stepped into the warmth of his home, he was greeted by the familiar scent of coffee and the soft hum of a radio playing quietly in the background. His wife, Maria, looked up from the kitchen with a gentle smile, her eyes filled with the steady understanding that came from years of shared life. She noticed something in his expression, a subtle weariness beneath his calm demeanor, and without a word, she placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Everything all right?" she asked, her voice low and tender. David nodded, setting the grocery bag on the counter. "Had a bit of a situation this morning," he replied, his tone steady but with a hint of heaviness. Maria tilted her head, studying him with the perceptiveness he'd come to rely on. She knew him well enough to sense the story beneath his words, and she waited, giving him space to share at his own pace. David took a deep breath, leaning against the counter, recounting the events with quiet clarity. The encounter with Officer Simmons, the assumptions, and finally the unexpected intervention from Colonel Green. Maria listened intently, her expression shifting from concern to a quiet sadness. She understood the weight of these moments, the familiar ache of seeing someone she loved judged unfairly, reduced to assumptions by strangers who knew nothing of his character or history. When he finished, she reached out, taking his hand in hers, a simple act of solidarity and strength. "It's hard to believe things like this still happen," she said softly, her voice laced with empathy. "But you handled it with the same grace you always do." David smiled faintly, her words offering him a sense of validation. "I guess it just reminded me that respect isn't something you can force someone to see. It has to come from them, or not at all." He paused, looking down at their joined hands. "But I think maybe that young officer learned something today. At least I hope he did." Maria gave his hand a gentle squeeze, her gaze unwavering. "He met a man of integrity today, someone who stood tall and didn't let anger take over. Maybe that's the most powerful lesson of all." They stood in silence for a moment, letting the quiet of the house settle around them, a comforting contrast to the tension of earlier. Finally, Maria smiled, releasing his hand and moving to unpack the groceries. "Well," she said, her voice light, "now that you're back, why don't you help me with breakfast? We've got the whole day ahead of us, and I'd say it's time to enjoy it." David chuckled, a warmth spreading through him. The familiarity of home and Maria's unwavering support grounding him once more. With a renewed sense of peace, he moved to help her, grateful for the life they had built together, a life that no passing judgment or misunderstanding could ever take from him. Together they prepared breakfast, the morning's events slipping further into the background, leaving behind only the quiet lessons and a deeper sense of resilience. As they worked side by side in the kitchen, a comfortable rhythm settled between David and Maria. The smell of eggs sizzling on the stove and fresh bread warming in the toaster filled the room, blending with the quiet melody from the radio. David felt the heaviness of the morning continue to lift, replaced by the simple joy of these shared moments. After a while, Maria broke the silence, her voice thoughtful. "You know," she began, glancing over at him, "it reminds me of that time a few years back, when we first moved back to town. Do you remember? That neighbor who thought you were a stranger just because he hadn't seen you in years?" David chuckled, recalling the memory. "Oh, I remember," he replied. "He asked me what I was doing on his street as if I didn't grow up just a few houses down." They both laughed softly, the memory now a light-hearted reminder of how far they'd come in their lives, and how certain perceptions sometimes took time to change. "Some people take longer to understand, but eventually they come around," Maria said with a knowing smile. "Just like that neighbor did, and who knows, maybe Officer Simmons will too." David nodded, letting her words settle in. "I hope so. I hope he learns to see people for who they are, not just what he assumes about them." He felt a warmth at the thought, a quiet satisfaction knowing he'd kept his dignity intact, giving the young officer a chance to grow rather than respond with anger. They finished preparing breakfast, setting the table together with a familiar ease that felt like a balm over the morning's tension. As they sat down, David poured the coffee, the rich, comforting scent filling the space between them. He felt a deep gratitude for Maria's steady presence, her unwavering belief in him, and the life they had built together, strong enough to weather any storm. Over breakfast, they talked about lighter things, the plans for the weekend, the possibility of visiting their daughter and her family, the new movie playing at the local theater. The conversation flowed easily, and David found himself laughing, his spirit fully restored in the company of the person who knew him best. As they finished their meal, the last traces of the morning's conflict seemed to fade, leaving only a quiet sense of peace. David knew that the world outside might still hold its challenges, but within these walls he was surrounded by respect, love, and understanding. And as he looked at Maria, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for her, for their life, and for the strength they shared that no misunderstanding could ever diminish. After breakfast, David helped Maria clear the table, their movements synchronized by years of shared routines and unspoken understanding. As he dried the dishes, he glanced out the kitchen window, watching the sunlight filter through the trees in their backyard. The tranquility of the scene settled something deep within him, a gentle reminder that life, in its simplest moments, held the truest peace. Maria seemed to notice his pensive mood. "Want to go for a walk?" she suggested, a warm smile lighting her face. "Fresh air might be good for both of us." David nodded, grateful for the invitation. They slipped on their jackets and stepped outside, strolling down the quiet, familiar streets together. The air was crisp, and the sounds of birds chirping created a peaceful backdrop to their slow, comfortable pace. They walked in silence at first, each lost in thought, enjoying the quiet companionship that required no words. After a while, Maria spoke up, her tone soft. "You know, David, I'm proud of you. The way you handled that situation today. I don't think many people would have shown such patience." David glanced at her, surprised but warmed by her words. "I suppose I've had years to practice patience," he said with a small chuckle, thinking back on his time in the military and the discipline it had instilled in him. "But you're right, sometimes it's not easy." They paused as they reached a small park, a place they often visited on their walks. The trees were shedding their leaves, painting the ground in shades of amber and gold. David watched a young couple sitting on a nearby bench, laughing softly, their hands intertwined. It reminded him of the early days with Maria, a time when life had been simpler yet filled with so much possibility. "I guess what I realized today," David began, his voice contemplative, "is that no matter what people assume or how they treat you, there's a strength in staying true to yourself. I can't change how others see me, but I can control how I respond." Maria nodded, squeezing his arm gently. "And that's exactly why I'm proud of you. You didn't let the officer's assumptions take away from who you are. You stood with dignity, and that makes all the difference." David felt her words settle warmly in his heart, a reassurance that resonated deeply. He knew the world outside wasn't always fair, that prejudice and assumptions would persist. But in moments like these, with Maria by his side, he felt resilient. Together they continued their walk, the quiet understanding between them stronger than ever. And as they strolled home, David felt a renewed commitment, not just to his own integrity, but to the small acts of kindness and patience that made the world, even in its imperfections, a place worth believing in. As they continued their walk through the park, the path winding beneath trees shedding their golden leaves, David found himself opening up more to Maria about the nuances of the morning. The air was crisp and each fallen leaf crunched under their feet, adding a rhythmic backdrop to his thoughts. "I think what hit me the hardest wasn't just what Officer Simmons assumed about me," David said, his tone reflective. "It was realizing how quickly people jump to conclusions about others, without stopping to really see who's in front of them. It's like all those years, all the sacrifices, can just disappear in someone else's eyes because they don't know, or they don't care to know. Maria nodded, listening closely, her gaze steady as she kept pace with him. I know, David. And it's unfair, especially when you've done so much for others. She paused thoughtfully, her expression warm but resolute. But I also think that what you did today left an impression. Simmons may not fully understand it now, but people remember these moments. It's hard to forget dignity when you see it, even if it takes time to understand. David absorbed her words, appreciating the hope she had that others could grow, even if they made mistakes. He thought back to his early days in the military, the times he'd stumbled, the lessons he'd learned from those who had shown him patience and understanding. Those small acts of kindness had shaped him into the man he was, and he supposed it was only right to pass that forward, even to someone like Simmons. As they reached the park's edge, they paused by a small lake, where the morning sun cast a warm glow across the water's surface. Ducks glided lazily, undisturbed by the world's troubles, their presence soothing in its simplicity. David leaned on the rail overlooking the lake, his gaze distant but softened. You know, he said after a moment, sometimes I wonder if people like Simmons even realize the weight of their actions, the assumptions they carry. It's like carrying a heavy bag but never looking inside to see what you're hauling around. They don't realize the harm those things can cause until they're forced to confront it. Maria rested a hand on his shoulder, her voice gentle. And you gave him that chance today, David. That's what matters. You can't force anyone to change, but you can plant seeds. And you did that, with patience, even when he didn't deserve it. David looked down, his fingers tapping lightly on the railing as he considered her words. He had felt anger bubbling beneath the surface during the encounter, but something in him had resisted the urge to lash out. Years of discipline, yes, but also a deep belief in his own integrity. He knew the person he was, and he knew that lowering himself to anger would only let Simmons win in a way he didn't deserve. That's what I always admired about you, Maria continued, her voice barely louder than a whisper but clear and full of conviction. You have this strength that isn't loud or brash, but it's unshakable. People notice that, even if they don't say it. David looked over at her, feeling a warmth that went beyond the morning sun. Maria had always seen him for who he truly was, even when the world tried to define him by its own limited perspective. It was her faith in him that had given him strength time and time again, reminding him of his worth, even in moments when others tried to diminish it. They continued their walk, following a narrow path that led back toward the town. David's mind drifted to the people he'd served with, friends who had been like family, each of them shaped by experiences that civilians could rarely understand. Some of those friends had struggled to reintegrate into society, facing similar judgments and assumptions. He knew their frustrations, the difficulty of coming back to a world that sometimes viewed them as strangers. In many ways, today's encounter was a reminder of those struggles, not just for himself, but for the others like him who walked silently, carrying their stories hidden beneath layers of quiet resilience. As they approached the town square, Maria looped her arm through his, grounding him back in the present. The square was slowly coming to life with townspeople setting up for the weekend market. Stalls with handmade goods, fresh produce, and local crafts were popping up around them, each vendor preparing for a day of cheerful interactions and community gathering. A few familiar faces greeted David and Maria as they passed, people who knew David not as a veteran or an object of suspicion, but as a neighbor, a friend. A young woman from a flower stall waved them over. She held out a small bouquet of wildflowers, her face warm with appreciation. David, Maria, she said with a smile, these are for you. Just a little thank you for being part of this town. We're lucky to have folks like you around. David accepted the flowers, genuinely touched by the gesture. Thank you, Amy. That means a lot, he said, feeling a sense of belonging in the simple act of kindness. Moments like these reminded him that he wasn't defined by others' perceptions. He was defined by his own actions, by the relationships he had built, and by the integrity he carried every day. As they walked back home, wildflowers in hand, David felt a deep sense of peace settling over him. The morning's events, though challenging, had served as a reminder of his own strength and the resilience he had built over a lifetime. Maria's unwavering support, the warmth of his neighbors, and even the difficult encounter with Simmons had all contributed to that feeling of rootedness, of knowing exactly who he was, no matter what assumptions others might make. He looked over at Maria, his heart swelling with gratitude for this life they had created together. The wildflowers seemed to symbolize something simple, yet profound. A reminder of the beauty that existed even amidst challenges, the quiet resilience that he and Maria had cultivated together over the years. As they neared their home, David felt a renewed sense of purpose. No matter what obstacles lay ahead, he knew he would face them with patience, strength, and the knowledge that he was surrounded by people who saw him for who he truly was. Back home, David placed the bouquet of wildflowers in a glass of water, setting it on the kitchen table where the sunlight caught each petal, casting soft colors across the room. He stood back for a moment, admiring the simple beauty of it, feeling the peace of the morning settle deeper within him. Maria watched him with a gentle smile, sensing that the flowers represented something more, a symbol of resilience, quiet strength, and the gratitude that filled their lives despite the challenges. As the day stretched on, they found themselves moving through familiar routines. David tidied up the small garden in the backyard, clearing away fallen leaves while Maria busied herself with a new recipe in the kitchen, her humming drifting through the open window. The ease of the day wrapped around them like a warm blanket, each task grounding them further into the life they'd built together. Later that afternoon, David sat in his favorite armchair by the window, a book in his lap, though he wasn't quite reading it. His thoughts drifted to the events of the morning, but now, in the quiet sanctuary of his home, they felt distant, almost as if they belonged to another world. He thought of Officer Simmons again, and a part of him hoped the young man was reflecting on what had happened, letting the encounter stir something deeper, something that might change the way he viewed people in the future. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Maria looked up from her place in the kitchen, a questioning look on her face. "Were we expecting anyone?" she asked. David shook his head, curiosity piqued as he stood and made his way to the door. When he opened it, he was surprised to find Officer Simmons standing on the porch, looking somewhat uneasy, his cap in his hands. The young officer seemed to fumble for words, clearly out of his element, and David felt a flicker of surprise, quickly masked by a calm expression. "Mr. Williams," Simmons began, his voice lower and softer than it had been that morning. I wanted to come by and apologize, properly." David held his gaze for a moment, studying the young man's face. He could see traces of embarrassment and sincerity, a look that hinted at genuine regret. Stepping aside, he gestured for Simmons to come in, sensing that this was an opportunity for something more than words, a chance for understanding. Simmons stepped into the living room, glancing around at the cozy, welcoming space, clearly feeling the weight of his earlier actions in this new context. Maria greeted him with a polite nod, offering a small, understanding smile before returning to the kitchen to give them privacy. David motioned for him to sit, taking his own seat across from him, waiting patiently, giving the young man the space to gather his thoughts. After a moment, Simmons cleared his throat, looking down at his hands. I thought about what you said, and I realized how wrong I was. I shouldn't have assumed anything about you, or anyone else for that matter." His voice was quiet, but there was a rawness to it, an acknowledgement of the harm he had caused. David nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Assumptions can be dangerous, officer. They can lead us to treat people in ways that aren't fair, ways that don't reflect who they truly are." His words were gentle but firm, inviting reflection rather than casting blame. Simmons looked up, meeting David's eyes with a newfound respect. "I don't know why I made those assumptions. Maybe it's just things I've learned along the way. But it doesn't make it right. I can see that now, and I'm sorry." David took a moment, letting the silence fill the room before he responded. Acknowledging it is the first step. We've all made mistakes, myself included. What matters is that we learn from them. He paused, his gaze steady. Respect isn't something you earn by just holding authority. It's something you build by the way you treat others, by being willing to see them for who they are, not just who you expect them to be. Simmons nodded, visibly moved by David's words. He seemed to sit a little straighter, as though absorbing the lesson not just into his mind, but into his heart. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I won't forget this. I want to be better for the people I'm supposed to serve." David extended his hand, a quiet forgiveness passing between them as Simmons took it with gratitude. There was strength in that simple gesture, an understanding that transcended words. It was a handshake that carried the weight of growth, humility, and the hope of positive change. As Simmons rose to leave, Maria reappeared, handing him a small bag of freshly baked cookies. "For the road," she said warmly, adding a touch of kindness that softened the moment. Simmons accepted them with a surprised smile, nodding gratefully. "Thank you, ma'am, and thank you both," he said, looking at David once more with genuine respect in his eyes before heading out the door. As the door closed, David felt a sense of closure, a resolution that felt both humble and profound. He turned to Maria, who was watching him with a proud smile. "You've always known how to guide people, David," she said softly, "even when they don't see it at first." David chuckled, feeling the warmth of her words settle within him. "Sometimes it just takes patience," he replied, echoing the lesson that had carried him through so many chapters of his life. He looked toward the door, where Simmons had left moments before, a faint hope stirring in his heart. Perhaps today's encounter would plant seeds that would grow in ways neither he nor Simmons could yet imagine. Together, he and Maria stood in the quiet of their home, the sun streaming through the window, casting light across the room. A reminder of hope, forgiveness, and the resilience that came from living with integrity. And in that moment, David knew that, no matter what the world brought, he would face it with the same strength, the same dignity, and the unwavering support of the woman beside him. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting a warm amber glow across their living room, David and Maria settled down together on the couch, the day's events still resonating softly between them. There was a peace now, a gentle understanding that had come from the unexpected visit by Officer Simmons. David felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing he had handled the situation with the integrity he valued so deeply. It wasn't every day that life offered the chance to turn conflict into understanding, and he was grateful for the opportunity to have made a difference. Maria leaned into him, her hand resting on his, their fingers interlaced. The silence between them was comfortable, a language of its own, built over years of shared moments, both ordinary and profound. She looked up at him, her gaze warm and proud. "You know, David," she said softly, "I think today was one of those moments that leaves a mark, not just on you or Officer Simmons, but on all of us who saw it happen. It's a reminder that sometimes the hardest thing is to stay calm, to not let anger take over, but you did that. And that's something rare." David smiled, squeezing her hand gently. "I suppose life's taught me a thing or two about patience," he replied with a light chuckle. "But I'm grateful to have had you by my side through it all. You've been my reminder to keep going, to hold on to the values that really matter." Maria's eyes softened, a hint of emotion flickering there. "I think we remind each other. That's the beauty of this journey, isn't it? Knowing that no matter what the world throws our way, we have a place to come back to. A place of peace." She paused, resting her head against his shoulder, her voice barely a whisper. "You're my peace, David." They sat there, watching the changing colors of the sky through the window, each moment deepening the sense of contentment they shared. David thought about the life they had built, the strength they'd gathered from years of experiences, both joyful and challenging. He realized that everything they had endured had brought them closer, had forged a bond that was unbreakable. a foundation upon which they could stand, even when life tested them. After a while, David spoke, his tone reflective. You know, this world isn't always easy for people like us, people who carry a past, who've been shaped by experiences others may never understand. But I think that's why we have to hold on to our values so strongly. It's what keeps us steady, what keeps us. Maria nodded, understanding him completely. And maybe it's what the world needs to see more of. People who can stand firm, who don't let the bitterness or the assumptions change them. People who choose to be a light, even when it's easier not to. David smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. He knew that was exactly what he wanted to be. A light, a reminder that integrity, patience, and kindness weren't weaknesses but profound strengths. Today had been a test of that belief, and as he sat there, he felt grateful for how it had unfolded, for the growth it had offered to him, to Simmons, and to anyone who had witnessed it. As night began to settle over the town, Maria rose to turn on a small lamp, its glow casting a gentle warmth over their cozy living room. She returned to the couch, nestling beside him once more, the two of them enveloped in the soft, comforting quiet of their home. Outside, the streetlights began to blink on, illuminating the paths people would travel, each light a beacon guiding them safely through the darkness. In that peaceful glow, David felt a profound sense of purpose, one that extended beyond his home, beyond his past. It was a purpose rooted in living by example, in showing others that respect and patience could bridge divides, heal wounds, and foster understanding. And as he sat with Maria, his heart full, he knew that tomorrow would bring new opportunities, new chances to live those values, to carry forward the lessons he had learned, and perhaps to inspire others to do the same. Together, they sat in silence, hand in hand, ready for whatever lay ahead, their spirits as steady as the quiet, enduring light that filled their home. As the evening deepened, David and Maria remained seated together, enjoying the quiet and the closeness they shared. The lamp cast a soft glow across the room, illuminating their familiar surroundings, each item a small piece of the life they had built over the years. The weight of the day's events had faded, leaving behind only a sense of gratitude and calm. After a while, Maria rose and went into the kitchen, returning with 2 mugs of tea. She handed one to David, settling beside him as they both sipped in companionable silence. The warmth of the tea seemed to mirror the warmth between them, a quiet comfort that needed no words. As they sat, David felt a sudden wave of memories wash over him, moments from his time in the service, times he had faced difficult situations, and times he had relied on the strength of his fellow soldiers. He thought of friends he hadn't seen in years, men and women who had shared in those unspoken bonds, each of them marked by their own journeys. Some had transitioned back to civilian life with ease, while others had struggled, their paths winding and uncertain. Today's encounter had stirred those memories, reminding him that the challenges he faced now, though different, still carried echoes of those past days. He found himself speaking, his voice thoughtful. You know, Maria, there were times in the service when we'd face situations that seemed impossible. Moments when all you had was the person beside you, and you'd rely on each other completely. Those experiences shape you, make you see the world a little differently. Maria looked at him, listening intently, her gaze full of understanding. She knew how deeply those experiences were woven into the fabric of who he was, how they had given him a unique strength and resilience. I imagine that's why you were able to handle things so calmly today, she replied. You've faced situations most people can't even imagine. It's made you who you are, strong, steady, patient. David nodded, appreciating her words. Maybe so, but I think it's also about choosing who I want to be now. Those experiences taught me a lot, but I still have to decide, every day, how I want to carry them forward. Today reminded me of that, of the importance of patience, and of showing respect even when it isn't given in return. They sipped their tea in silence, Maria's hand resting on his arm, a small, reassuring gesture. After a moment, she spoke again, her voice gentle. "I think you're right, David. And I think that's what makes you exceptional. You don't let the world change you. Instead, you stand as a reminder of what's possible. That's a gift, not just to me, but to everyone who crosses your path." David smiled, feeling the truth in her words resonate deeply. It wasn't about grand gestures or public recognition. It was about living each day with integrity, knowing that small actions, quiet patience, and simple kindness could create ripples far beyond what he could see. He had always believed that, but moments like today reaffirmed that belief, reminding him that his values had a quiet, enduring power. As the night settled fully around them, David felt a deep sense of peace. He knew the world wasn't perfect, and that there would always be moments of misunderstanding, of unfair judgment. But he also knew that he had a choice in how he responded, that he could choose to meet each challenge with patience, to set an example, and to let his life speak of resilience and respect. Finishing his tea, he looked over at Maria, who had leaned her head against his shoulder, her eyes closing as she drifted into a comfortable doze. He smiled softly, his heart full of gratitude for her presence, her unwavering support, and the quiet strength she offered him every day. As he sat there holding her hand, he felt a profound sense of purpose settle within him. He knew that the journey ahead would have its share of difficulties, but he also knew he wasn't facing it alone. Together, he and Maria were a team, grounded in shared values and a commitment to living with dignity, compassion, and love. In that stillness, David felt as if the world had softened around them, as if all the challenges, the misunderstandings, and the judgments had faded away, leaving only what truly mattered: the people they loved, the values they held dear, and the quiet, unshakable peace that came from knowing exactly who they were. With a final glance at the darkened street outside, David closed his eyes, his heart at rest, ready to face whatever the next day might bring. The next morning dawned clear and bright, sunlight spilling through the window and filling the room with a gentle warmth. David stirred, blinking as he adjusted to the new day. Beside him, Maria was still peacefully asleep, her face softened in the early light. He watched her for a moment, feeling a deep, abiding gratitude for her presence and the quiet strength she brought into his life. Carefully, he slipped out of bed, not wanting to disturb her, and made his way to the kitchen. As he brewed a pot of coffee, the events of the previous day flickered through his mind, not with the heaviness of before, but with a renewed sense of clarity and calm. He poured himself a cup and stepped out onto the back porch, the crisp morning air filling his lungs. Standing there, he looked out over the yard, taking in the simple beauty of the morning, the gentle rustling of leaves, the sound of a bird calling from a nearby tree. The world felt fresh and full of promise, and David felt a quiet sense of renewal within himself. The weight of yesterday's encounter had softened into something valuable, a lesson that reminded him of his own resilience and the purpose he found in staying true to his principles. He thought of Officer Simmons and the humbling conversation they'd shared. It struck him that the young man's visit had been a turning point, not just for Simmons but for himself as well. It had reaffirmed his belief in the power of integrity and the quiet strength that came from standing firm in his values. He knew he would carry that encounter with him, a reminder that change was possible, even if it started with small, unassuming moments. A soft creak behind him made him turn. Maria had joined him on the porch, wrapped in a cozy sweater, her eyes warm and full of understanding. She slipped her arm through his, leaning into him as they looked out over their little world together. "Beautiful morning," she said softly, her voice filled with the gentle optimism that always seemed to lift him. David nodded, squeezing her hand. "It is. Feels like a fresh start." They stood in silence, savoring the moment, letting the calmness of the morning seep into their bones. In that stillness, David felt as if everything was exactly as it should be, as if each challenge, each act of grace, had led them to this perfect moment of peace. As the sun rose higher, they eventually made their way back inside, ready to face the day ahead, with open hearts and steady minds. They didn't know what challenges might lie ahead, but they knew they would face them together, grounded in a quiet strength that no one could shake. And as they moved through the small, familiar rituals of their morning, they carried with them a deep, unspoken promise to live each day with patience, dignity, and love, a promise that would ripple outward, touching lives in ways they couldn't always see but knew were lasting and true. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit that like button. Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. And if you want more stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.